it's Andrew Hall, and this is Dead Hand Radio. My guest for this episode is Tom Whitmore, an accountant by trade and a researcher by choice. He's been a member of MUFON since the mid 90s and is currently heavily involved in research on the MJ12 documents and their significance to the UFO topic. Tom publishes his research on his blog, and his latest article, titled Psychological Warfare and Strategic Deception, is the topic of our discussion tonight. Welcome back to Dead Hand Radio, Tom.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm glad to be here. I'm looking forward to it.
It's always a pleasure to have you, and this is our third or fourth public meeting, and hopefully it'll continue. I think the work that you're doing is important, and it's interesting, and I love talking to you about it.
Well, thank you, and I enjoy being on your show.
Cool, thank you. So this latest article that you wrote, we'll start with that, but there's a lot to get into. The title, for one thing, is intriguing because you integrated the term psychological warfare. Now, in times that we've talked previously, you've explained what the MJ12 documents are. Would you just give a really quick recap of what the MJ12, just for any new listeners that may not be familiar with it?
During the 1980s, two UFO researchers, William Moore and Stanton Friedman, interviewed a lot of witnesses about the so-called Roswell incident. And in their research, they started developing a theory and a list of names that they thought might be involved in the follow-up of what they believed to be captured flying saucer and bodies. During the 1980s, William Moore conducted a great deal of private research behind the scenes, and he was involved with a AFOSI special agent by the name of Richard Doty. And in 1984, William Moore, through his research associate Jamie Chandray, received a set of two documents. They were actually not original documents, they were photographs of documents. They received an undeveloped roll of film, which they developed. And the two documents are known today as the Eisenhower Briefing Document and the Truman Forrestal Memo. Also, they received hints about a third document, and William Moore and Jamie Chandray traveled to the Washington, D.C. area to the National Archives. And according to them, they discovered a third document that's known as the Cutler-Twining Memo. Those were the original MJ12 documents. Now, since then, in the late 80s, we had the claims by Robert Lazar. And into the 90s, we had, there were a lot of documents that went to a researcher by the name of Timothy Cooper. And those came from two or three different sources. Also, during the 1990s, a document appeared similarly to the way the original MJ12 documents appeared. It's known as the SOM 1-01 manual, which is allegedly a manual for recovery of UFOs. Then also a person came along by the name that calls himself Dan Burrish, who claimed to be a scientist working on Area 51 with an alien. Then we had the Serpo story come out in the 2000s. And then as late as 2017, we had a document come out that I call the ultra top secret document. And what this is telling me is something, for some reason, we've been getting a bunch of very questionable documents over a 40-year period. And in my humble opinion, this is what I refer to as the MJ12 affair, because somebody or something or some group keeps feeding very questionable documents through the back door into the public domain, all associated with this rumored group of MJ12, which, according to the original documents, was a group of very high-level military and government and science and engineering experts that were allegedly studying the recovered Roswell craft.
And that's the Majestic 12 that you're referring to.
Yes.
And supposedly that group. Now, has there ever been any evidence to support that this group actually existed?
Well, it depends on who you talk to. Uh, I think even Richard Doty has hinted that MJ12 existed. Now, the question is, was it a UFO related group or was it something else? The Woods, Robert and Ryan Wood, the team of the two, Robert and Ryan Wood, did a lot of research on the MJ12 documents, and they, on their website, there's a person that claims to have seen the Eisenhower briefing document, in a separate situation. And I think somebody else claimed to have seen the Psalm 1 manual or something like it. But these are vague, really unattributed sources. There is one of the so-called aviary who was Condor in the 1980s UFO documentary UFO Cover-Up Live. His name is Robert Collins, and he came out with a book that's called Exempt from Disclosure, and made a lot of claims about MJ12 in there. But we don't have really solid chain of custody, substantive sources that will attest to the existence of MJ12 or something like it.
Okay, so let's switch the conversation a little bit from these documents. Uh, we'll get back into more of those a little bit later because you mentioned a couple of um, a couple of programs or documents or incidents uh, that are part of this overall. In your mind, it's an op. Um, so let's talk a little bit about and let people bring people up to speed on what psychological operations are and how they are used in real world situations. Uh, what's their purpose?
Well, psychological operations are mostly propaganda. And propaganda is information that's being put out, like I said in my paper, for a specific purpose. It's propaganda can take any number of forms, from advertising to public relations to crisis management to actual psychological warfare techniques being used during wartime. But psychological operations and psychological warfare involve getting groups of people doing what you want them to do or to not do what you don't want them to do. And typically in wartime, psychological operations involve communicating with the enemy troops, and the adversary civilian population. And that can range anywhere from advising enemy troops on how they can defect to our side, advising them that there is going to be a bombing run the next day, they might want to evacuate, advising civilians on what to do and how to act when our forces arrive, and things like that. And those are pretty much overt forms of communication. The most basic form of psychological operation is the leaflet. And many leaflets were dropped in World War II and in the Korean War. And they really went crazy in Vietnam. They probably dropped, the U.S. government and the military probably dropped billions of leaflets in Vietnam. But, communication goes through normal communication channels, radio. You can have loudspeakers on top of a truck or a Jeep, and so on and so forth. So it's psychological warfare is a means of communication for specific purposes. And Now, it doesn't have to be during wartime because every government of any size has the challenge of making sure that their own public, their own population, uh, understands what they're supposed to be doing and understands what the way they should be thinking and looking at things. And psychological warfare today might sound a little too harsh. I think they've come up with a couple of other euphemisms like perception management and strategic influence.
Then you mentioned that it's basically, well, it started out in an official capacity during World War One, and it was adopted during that period, and then um, it was continued. It was actually almost discontinued at one point. In my research, I was looking into it some, but they realized what a valuable tool it was, so they kept it. In fact, developed a training station for it, and now every branch of the U.S. military has their own psychological operations unit. Plus, the CIA has their own psychological operations unit. Um, it's just a valuable tool in warfare. But what if it's used, and what you're suggesting with your studies and your articles is that it's being used against the American public? What are some of the implications that is that it could bring up um, by doing that? First of all, what happens if it's ever found out that these programs were actually psychological ops perpetuated against the U.S. population?
Well, I don't know if we would ever learn that. And I wouldn't go so far as to say that I know or that I even advocate that a psychological operation about UFOs is being perpetrated against the American people. But if we look at UFO history and if we look at the actual public releases, the official releases of information, which I've listed in my paper, we do see a pattern. And that pattern is one of denial that UFOs are not a problem. They're not a threat to national security. Most all UFO sightings and reports are misidentifications of natural phenomena or so on and so forth. And that, it should be played down. It should be debunked. And if we look, through UFO history, if we look at the release, the press release on Project Blue Book Special Report number 14, if we look at what the Robertson panel did and decided, you look at the report, the so-called Condon report, scientific study of unidentified objects, and then you got to skip ahead a lot of years, but you get to the 1990s and Colonel Weaver's book, the Roswell report, that dealt with the mogul balloon situation, and then you had the follow-up Roswell case closed by who was Lieutenant McAndrew. I'm not sure what his rank was when he published that book. You have that, and for most of UFO history, we've had a pattern of denial. Now, I argue that the United States government, at the highest levels at the National Security Council, is capable of long-term programs. There was a very important communication that occurred by George Kennan, and it became known as the Long Telegram. And George Kennan, I believe, is in the State Department in Moscow or in Russia. And he advocated a policy of containment against Soviet aggression. Now, we're going way back to late 40s, early 50s here. And the United States government did conduct a consistent long-term program of containment against the Soviet Union, and eventually it prevailed. Okay, So it's not outside of the realm of possibility that if there has been one or more, there have been one or more saucers recovered, bodies, maybe even a live alien or two, that there could have been a long-term policy of denial because the powers that be or whoever is in possession of this information does not want it made public. It's a possibility. I don't know, and we'll never have the opportunity to go into the CIA and throw typewriters out of windows and go through all their documents. It's just not going to happen.
Uh, the and you made a lot of good points, and I want to stay on target with this. So the let's step back to the psychological aspect or the psychological operations part of this, and talk about, first I asked you what are the implications if it ever came out, and we probably will never know that. I totally get that, but there have been instances where the U.S. government has perpetrated some illegal activity within the U.S. on U.S. soil, and then it later did come out, and the fallout from those programs was pretty devastating for the government. I'm talking about the MK Ultra program, and the was it the there was a group of shoot, you know what? I don't have all that data, but there have been several programs where the U.S. government did some illegal activity, and it did come out later. It didn't bode well for them. So that said, what is Project Revere?
Uh, Project Revere is something I turned up in one of my sources because during the 1950s, well, the government knew that we had a problem with the Soviet Union, and they were very concerned that the Russians were developing atomic weapons that they could, fly over the North Pole and start dropping bombs or eventually build missiles and send them over. So Project Revere was a study in psychological operations in which the Air Force dropped leaflets, mostly in several northwestern states. Some of the leaflets contained advertisements, and some of them contained, I think, kind of like civil information.
Uh, our,
And
our stream just got cut off there for a second.
can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the place that it got cut off for me, I'm not sure if everybody was cut off, but where it cut off for me was the northwestern states of the U.S. were um, had
Yeah.
leaflets dropped with advertising.
With advertising and some other, messages, civil affairs type messages. And the idea was to see if people were reading it and to see how the information was spreading, among the population. That was Project Revere. I believe they spent something on the neighborhood of $300 to $500,000 on the project. It's the only leaflet dropping project on the American population that I know of, that I've heard of. But they were, it was the Cold War, it was the McCarthy era, that people were really paranoid about communism and about Russia. So they're trying to figure out, ways that we're going to prepare even for a possible nuclear war, or possibly maybe the Russians invading Western Europe. They were scared to death after World War II because Stalin had all the military, he had all the soldiers and the weaponry, and we didn't have nearly what he had in Western Europe. So there was a lot of concern about that.
Well, but they, I mean, regardless of what the reason the program uh, was done for, what the goal of the program was, it was done, and you can look at it from two perspectives. If you look at it from the U.S. government's perspective, they were able to effectively develop a way of disseminating information and tracking that information through specific groups of people. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and that's what they do during wartime anyway, or it's what they should do and they're supposed to do.
And then,
There's kind of a classic book about psychological warfare by an author by the name of Paul Linebarger, and he wrote it after World War II. But if you're doing psychological operations properly, you've studied the adversary's mindset. You know what it is that you want to communicate. You design the communication. You disseminate it in a way that it'll be received and understood, and then you follow up to see how effective it was. So that's a logical process.
and that could also be uh, perceived as Exhibit A if this was a court and we were trying to prove your hypothesis that these programs were perpetrated on the U.S. population for the government to, you know, disseminate this information, and then track the information and see where it lands, and how it impacts those communities of people. Um, that's a pretty strong argument in support of what your thesis is, right?
It could be viewed that way. I think that the main mechanism by which policies are communicated is through the regular media. Through what was newspapers. Newspapers aren't so prevalent now, but in the 50s and 60s and up until the internet, at the time of the internet, you had newspapers, and then you had radio, and you had television. And if you look at the broad patterns of the behavior of the media, you can identify certain approaches and types of behavior. During the 50s, newspapers were covering UFO sightings. They were covering UFO activity. But gradually, over time, the Air Force, I think, exerted its influence to the point that they convinced enough people in the press that UFOs were not really a problem. And by the time they got out of Project Blue Book, it was really to the point that the UFO subject was almost dead in terms of the national media. And I remember complaints in the UFO community back in the 90s and the 2000s that the New York Times virtually had a blackout on UFOs. They simply did not cover the subject, period. So, the behavior of the national media conforms in general with a policy of denial, concerning UFOs. Now, is there a committee of people drawing up psychological warfare plans on UFOs? I don't know, but you can see these broad patterns over time.
It could also be argued that these these news organizations that refused to cover it were, you know, not just against covering it for whatever reason, but they were afraid to cover it because of blowback from their peers, from the scientific community, from the uh, academic community. I mean, there was a huge stigmatism to this, and still to this day, it's still. I mean, we're getting to a point where it's adopted more and more, but I mean, they're they like you said, the government really did an effective job of keeping a lid on this thing, on this within the media. Now, that doesn't stop the ground roots effort of the people who are actually experiencing these things and know that no official explanation is going to satisfy what it is they actually saw. So there's no way to shut the people up about it, but you could certainly, through official channels, you could shut down those outlets, those major media outlets, which is what was done for so long. And I think you make that argument in your paper pretty well. Um, but the in fact, the MJ12 documents themselves. One of a quote that I took out of your article is the documents and related claims might themselves be forms of psychological warfare, propaganda, and deception. Now, we've talked about this before, but I want to again, different audience, um, new people watching this. How could these documents, and not just the MJ12, but the other programs that you mentioned as well, how could they be um, considered psychological warfare, and why would they be used as psychological warfare?
There are several aspects to that. Um, the MJ12 affair really began during the 1980s when there was a lot of intrigue surrounding the activities of Paul Benowitz. And I think that AFOSI on Kirtland, the National Security Agency, and possibly other intelligence groups were hip to the fact that Paul Benowitz he was watching and monitoring too many things on Kirtland Air Force Base. And the intelligence people knew that the Soviets were poking around. They were, also, they're always very interested in the latest technological developments going on in the U.S. And some of those were going on Kirtland Air Force Base. So it's kind of an association of different circumstances, but it's possible that these documents, or some of them, were introduced maybe to see, were the Soviets approaching people about it? Were was anyone in the UFO community approaching the Soviets? Did anyone that Paul Benowitz knew, were any of them involved with any espionage activity? That's one side of it, and it's a possibility. Another side is that if Roswell is an historical fact of a flying saucer being recovered and bodies and maybe even a live alien, that maybe it was obvious. If it happened, it was obviously under extreme secrecy, but maybe some people wanted to get some of that information out to the public, and they did it in such a way as to provide plausible deniability. Okay. A third possibility is that uh, uh, given the Paul Benowitz affair in the 80s, by putting these documents into the public domain, it created a lot of a lot of intrigue in the UFO community, and maybe they were getting people focused on that and not focused on something else. In other words, it was a diversion. So and those are just three possibilities.
Yeah, you're right. There could be dozens of possibilities. I mean, because these type of programs keep popping up, and we'll come back to that in just a minute. But I took another quote off of your article. In order for propaganda and deception to be effective, planners must have a thorough understanding of a target's group mentality. So, in other words, if these are government disseminated psyops, then there could potentially be people who have studied the UFO topic or embedded themselves into the UFO community. Um, does this mean that the U.S. government personnel could potentially be monitoring and posing as members of the UFO community to this day?
Yes. But the extent of that and their actual activities, I'm not trying to exaggerate that. But you don't have to be a genius to figure out what people in the UFO community want to believe. That's pretty obvious. And during the 70s, the point has been made that the Air Force could have been getting very paranoid about what the UFO people were up to because they were filing FOIA requests. They were suing the CIA and the NSA to get documents released, and they had gotten on this Roswell case. Now maybe Roswell wasn't anything anomalous, but maybe it was. And Bill Moore himself said that Roswell opened a can of worms. So, they had a reason to want to maybe take some countermeasures. And Leonard Stringfield in the 70s had been collecting stories of UFO crash recoveries. He gave a big presentation at the MUFON Symposium in 1978 in where the same town Wright-Patterson Air Force Base is, Dayton, Ohio, the MUFON Symposium. So if the Air Force people or whoever in the intelligence community were paying attention, they knew that they could see that things were heating up, so that there could have been some motivation there.
Well, the way things are today, I mean, you have hundreds of UFO conventions and symposiums throughout the country, throughout the year. It's not just a couple of conventions anymore. Um, how difficult would it be for, if, and again, this we're speculating, okay? If anybody listening to this thinks that we are talking factual, evidence backed, real world scenarios, that's not what we're doing here. We are speculating because there is no evidence to support. There's anecdotal
There's no
evidence
proof.
and conjecture, right? But we're just speculating. So, my question is, how difficult would it be, or how important would it be to monitor and infiltrate all of those conventions, or would you just need to select a few that you attend?
Richard Doty has said that now he didn't give the year, and Richard Doty was a AFOSI special agent in counterintelligence, and until I think 1986, he didn't give the year, but he said he was at a meeting where they had a lot of intelligence people, something like 150 or more, and they were tasked with developing two to three contacts in the UFO community. Now that's worldwide. Okay. Now at the moment I'm studying AFOSI, and AFOSI is worldwide. They're in Africa, they're in Europe, they're in Asia, they're in the Pacific, as well as the U.S. And AFOSI have districts and areas all over the country, and they're on most any halfway major U.S. Air Force base. Now the AFOSI mostly deals with more ordinary type crimes, and even fraud and things like that. But they do have a counterintelligence capability, and that's, I'm sure, to protect the secrets that the military has, mostly in technology, and they protect classified information. So, the possibility that we could be infiltrated or monitored, that's almost a no-brainer. Now, Doty has even, he's been asked, well, how can you tell if people from the government or from AFOSI or whomever are at a UFO conference? And he said, well, they're well dressed, they're well groomed, they stand apart, and he said definitely that they're not authorized to interfere, to participate, but they are authorized to watch and monitor. And maybe they go back to their bosses and they report, maybe somewhere, I think it's probably the DIA. They want to know, what are the UFO people focusing on? What are they talking about? What are they thinking about? And they could be wanting to know that for a number of reasons. Even the most exotic being that maybe they do have some deep, dark secret, and they want to know if anybody's getting close to it. Or it could be more mundane reasons, like or the Russians or the Chinese cultivating UFO people, et cetera, et cetera.
Another possibility that, just to pile on because it's such an interesting topic, but one other reason that they could be monitoring is that there are grassroots efforts or grassroots researchers and people actually in the field studying the phenomena. And in some instances, people may have come in to possession of what could be considered crash debris. And if that's true, the government certainly wants to know about that, right?
I would think so.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
That's what the proof, the physical proof, I think, is what is referred to as the hot stuff.
Okay, that's the first time I've heard that term, personally. Although, I'm not a deep researcher like yourself. I'm not an investigator, field investigator, um, or even a member of MUFON. I just have a podcast where I talk to people about this. But I have talked to people who have researched this in depth. And another reason that you may have touched on it, but it could also be that there are researchers that are looking into this topic that may have uncovered answers and looked at uh, possible avenues of attack for learning more about this topic that the government hasn't yet figured out for themselves. So by monitoring what the civilian sector is doing, they could actually learn something from them, unless they're too arrogant, and feel like we're just a bunch of hicks that don't know any better, right?
Yeah, I mean, if there's really anything to this whole idea of back engineering, then I'm sure that at some level, the literature is being reviewed. I mean, the scientific literature, these people that get into, free energy and gravitational theory and all that, I'm sure they monitor those kinds of things. And uh, there have been claims that from some parties that they got a little piece of what they think may be a UFO. We had the Arts Parks affair, um, and some of that may have ended up with TTSA.
Right.
Jacques Vallée is coming out with a book. It's co-authored with Paola Harris, um, and I believe it has something to do with material that he's had analyzed. That'll be it'll be very interesting to see, what is actually in that book. Now, Jacques Vallée is very careful, and it's extremely unlikely that he would publish anything that wouldn't stand up to public scrutiny. Now, I'm not saying that he has proof. I don't know, but it'll be interesting to see what he comes out with.
Yeah, there's already been a little bit of a firestorm. Why I don't know because nobody's read the book yet, as far as except for maybe beta readers. Um, and I don't understand why people are starting to bash the book already before the book even comes out. That just makes no sense. Now, could that be something that is maybe a manipulation or a disinfo campaign that has been started by somebody?
Could be,
Hmm.
but people were some people were trashing Luis Elizondo when he
Right.
came out, and that seems to be the way the world works in the UFO world. No matter how good of a reputation somebody has, you come out with something and people stomp all over it.
Wow.
Some people do.
Yeah, and it's very focused groups or individuals, but it seems like certain individuals have a a lot of influence, and then they will use that influence to sway public opinion one way or the other. For to do that to a book that has not come out yet, I mean, that kind of raises the red flag for me to think maybe there's something in that book that somebody knows about what's in the book. They want to try to, you know, minimize the impact of what that book has. So they start this campaign of a disinfo campaign against that particular book to discredit the book before it even comes out.
Well, people are human. There's human nature, and some people are probably jealous. I mean,
True.
Jacques Vallée is, I think, by anyone's estimation, UFO royalty,
True.
and I'm sure some people are jealous of him. But that makes me think back to the 1990s when the so-called alien autopsy film came out, and I was in MUFON at the time, and I had some pretty high-level contacts in MUFON, and there were a couple of people that knew some of the things that were going on over in Britain when Ray Santilli was coming out with this material. And one person in particular was just adamant that it was fake, but he hadn't even seen it yet. And I said, "You haven't even seen the movie yet, and you're saying that it's fake." It did turn out, in the longer term, it has turned out to be fake because Philip Mantle, particularly in Britain, has, done enough research to the preponderance of the evidence is that it's a forgery, it's a hoax,
And
and it did turn
really
out
all
to
we
be
have to
that.
go
So,
on.
but that's over time,
Mhm.
that things pan out.
The preponderance of evidence is something that people, sometimes take with a grain of salt, that term, because it's thrown around so lightly, or loosely. But I mean, what it boils down to is that's really all we have. We have limited access to evidence, to real hard evidence. So if the evidence points if there's an overwhelming amount of evidence or a preponderance of evidence, and it points to a certain conclusion, that's more than likely what the conclusion or the truth is. That's all we can really go on. I mean, if we disagree with that, you're stepping into the realms of taking it on faith, or you know getting into the area of a belief system that goes outside of the mainstream. um, and those points all have their own implications that we don't need to go down. But so the propaganda and the disinformation and the psychological operations aspect of this whole thing. I've asked you this before, and I know your answer, but I want to ask it anyway. Again, um, what's the possibility that these programs, or possibly even just some of these programs, are perpetrated by a foreign government to cause that fog of uncertainty or that fog of confusion within the UFO community here?
Yes, it's possible. That's another uh, potentiality in this whole milieu of questionable documents. Um, all major powers, China, Russia, the United States, Britain, etc., they all create phony documents. Now, most of them are related directly to espionage work, forging passports, that kind of thing. but they all have intelligence agencies that can create all kinds of stuff. And if we're talking about the Russians maybe creating the MJ12 documents, they'd have to be pretty careful because they'd have to know English well enough, for it not to be detectable that it was of Russian origin. One of the things about the Eisenhower briefing document is that some of the detail is so precise, and the broad overview of the appearance of the document makes one think that somebody did some research on this. If it's a hoax, if it's phony, if someone created this out of whole cloth, they did some pretty substantial research, to create that document, and that makes me think that it might be government related
Yeah, it would
because
seem. Go ahead.
there's only so much that a guy in his underwear at 2 a.m. in his mother's basement eating cold pizza can do. Okay.
Well,
And
especially in the '80s when you had limited access to the means of creating such a hoax, right?
yeah, and uh, like I said, I think this whole incident has occurred over a 40-year period. And that makes me think that it's not just a simple hoax. I mean, there have been UFO hoaxes. There was an instance, I think, where Jim Moseley, he's an old timer. He passed away, but he created a hoax document. There have been you have the contactees and Billy Meyer, and there was a hoax up in Canada. And there are different hoaxes, but the MJ12 affair, it strikes me as having a little more going on than just a pure hoax.
Um, Man, so many things we could talk about, but let me go to the chat room for a question because Rodrigo, and welcome Rodrigo, by the way. Thanks for being here, man. Um, Also, Shani, I saw a post that person made a few minutes ago, but I don't see it now. Oh, that's Shani. Jack Valet is the man. Yeah, um, true, absolutely true. But so Rodrigo asked if you are familiar with Bob White's materials from a UFO. Do you know who Bob White is?
I don't know of a person named Bob White. Now I know Bob Collins. He was Condor in the aviary, and I know Bob Wood. He's a MJ. He's very pro MJ12, and
Are those people in any way have made claims of having crashed UFO materials?
not physical material.
Okay, well, Rodrigo, if you could provide us a little bit more information on that, maybe we could figure it out or give us a new avenue to look at. Uh, but certainly something to look at. And welcome, Predator from Romania. Thanks for being here, man. Um, the material was a canonical slag dropped from the UFO. Oh, I think I might have heard about this. There was a documentary on TV about a guy who had shot at a UFO and a piece of the UFO fell off. Is that the one you're talking about, Rodrigo? Um, but are you familiar with that incident where this guy shot at the UFO and a piece of material fell off and it was like a drip? It dripped off of the UFO?
Are you asking me?
Yes, Tom.
Yeah. Uh, I'm not familiar with that. Now, it does make me think of the Maury Island incident, which I think the consensus is that that's a hoax. But that involved claims that slag from a UFO, dropped onto the beach. Uh, in the Puget Sound area, but I'm not familiar with what you just mentioned.
Okay. So yes, Rodrigo, thank you for pointing that one out. If his name indeed is Bob White, that may be something for you to look into, Tom. I know that's not really your area of research, but the could
Anyway,
be.
hello, Rodrigo. Welcome.
Yes, right. Uh, and welcome to everybody that's in the chat room right now. Please keep the questions coming in. Um, we are going to get to more questions that I had before the show started, but if you guys have any questions, we're happy to take them. Now, Project Mockingbird is a program that, or Operation Mockingbird is a program that is it there is evidence to support it, but it was supposedly discontinued, and it's a CIA operation where they had interns, or they had CIA operatives interning with some of the major mainstream outlets in media. Um, they were basically caught doing that, and it caused a big storm. I think Associated Press um, did a big write up on that, and they withdrew the operatives from their positions and they canceled the program. Uh, do you think that could still be going on? And if so, how could that be used to their advantage in regards to UFO topics?
I think it's likely that it's going on. Now, Carl Bernstein wrote an article about the relationship between the CIA and the journalist community, and I referred to it in my paper, this paper that we're discussing. And when you think about it, journalism has a lot of advantages for the CIA. They can take their own personnel, and their cover can be as a journalist, but we're talking about mostly in foreign countries, okay?
Right.
But on the other hand, the CIA needs, or it feels that it needs, to have relationships with the media, the people that run the major media. They they just need that. So there's an interaction between the CIA, maybe a legitimate journalist goes over to a foreign country, and they come back and they report on some things to either directly to a CIA employee or indirectly, back to the CIA. So the journalism community provides a means by which information can flow and people can be put undercover, in situations, or even a legitimate journalist could be playing a dual role of actually doing journalism, but at the same time working as an asset for the CIA. And Carl Bernstein wrote about this pretty extensively. It's pretty easy to find on the internet if you want to look it up. Now, how does that relate to UFOs? Let's go back in history. We had Donald Menzel, who was writing books on UFOs, big debunker. We've had Phil Klass. We've had Carl Sagan. We've had other debunkers. Even up to the present day, we've had Neil deGrasse Tyson. And here's another pattern long term of people that, are debunking the UFO field, and they have a fairly large presence in the national media, relatively large presence. Now, are they reporting to the CIA or whomever, the DIA? I don't know, probably not. But there are ways to arrange to have the public perceive certain things in a certain way. Now, given enough time, okay? So the pattern, now we've had plenty of UFO proponents. We've had Donald Kehoe, we've had Paul or Hynek, Dr. Hynek, we've had, these Jacques Vallée and other people that have been big UFO proponents, but we've also had debunkers. And you can't help but wonder if there hasn't been some consistency over the long term.
Right. Jeremy McGowan just joined us, Tom, and perfect timing, Jeremy. We just started talking about Project Mockingbird or Operation Mockingbird, and
Oh, fantastic.
if it's potentially still in use to this day, which I think we can all agree that there's a strong possibility of it, and there's even some evidence. Do you want to? First of all, have you two met each other? Do you guys know
I
each
have
other?
never had the pleasure of speaking with Mr. Whitmore, so it's an absolute pleasure to meet you, sir.
Thank you, Jeremy. Welcome. Glad to be here.
Appreciate it.
Good to meet you.
Andrew has spoken very highly about you, and I've been following your work for a little while now, so I appreciate all the effort that you've been putting into this. Andrew, can you do me a favor? Can you go on to the private chat on Twitter, shoot me the link for the YouTube on this so I can let
Yes.
folks know that I have now jumped across from the Unidentified Celebrity Review and am now live with you?
Let's see. You want me to drop it in Twitter?
Yeah, just on our just the YouTube link for on our private chat on Twitter that we have with the big group. Just send that to me there because all the other guys want to push it as well.
And I think I just posted it in the right place. But while we're there, let's see.
Yep, got it.
Yeah, Predator. That's a cool video. He's talking about Skinny Bob. That's a little bit outside of what we're talking about right here. But are you familiar with that video, the Skinny Bob video, Tom?
Yes, I am. In fact, I attended a remote, I think it was a Maryland MUFON meeting where a person over there had done really extensive analysis of the Skinny Bob video. And usually when you get into this kind of thing, people start finding inconsistencies and discrepancies. I know that one person who's a dear friend of mine, Sue Switek, who's the Virginia State Director for MUFON, she's absolutely convinced that it's phony. But deciding on whether something like that is genuine or fake, that's above my pay grade. I have enough trouble looking at documents without analyzing, film and video. I let other people do that.
It's a pretty convincing video, and but without having the evidence trail or the original footage, it's really hard to say if it's real or fake. Man, it would be cool if it was real, though, right?
God, who was I talking to last week? It may have been Lou Angels to Luis Jimenez with the Unidentified Celebrity Review because he's an actor, so it makes sense that he would have been saying this. But he was saying that a lot of his friends, it was him. He was saying a lot of his friends that are in the Hollywood community, special effects artists and folks like that, they've taken a look at the Skinny Bob video, and every single one of them has said straight up it's CGI. And when we're looking at this and saying, well, how come nobody's taking credit for it? He says, well, think of it this way. As a CGI artist, your work is your calling card. So if you go in for an interview as a CGI artist and the guy is saying, well, what have you been able to do? What is your portfolio? And he plops down the Skinny Bob video and he goes, that was me. And it's one of the most viral videos that has ever been on the internet. That's just a heck of a calling card. It's a really good resume statement. So from
Absolutely.
the guys in CGI and in Hollywood, they're saying that Skinny Bob is a resume.
Interesting.
Makes perfect sense. But again, outside of what we're really talking about at this point, that's just an interesting little tidbit. Thanks for the question, though, Predator. So Walter Bosley was AFOSI and is a household name in the UFO field. It says agencies have their assets paying close attention. Does the panel think this is a problem? That's a good question, Rodrigo. Thank you. So, is it a problem that the AFOSI and other intelligence agents in the community are paying close attention to what we're doing in the community, in the UFO community?
Tom, you want to take lead on that one?
I don't, it's not a problem per se because so much of the information is publicly available. And I mean, intelligence agencies and the military and government agencies, they do probably most of their work through public sourced information. So to take MUFON as an example that I'm familiar with because I'm on the board, but you have the MUFON, you subscribe to the MUFON Journal and you can get copies of the symposium proceedings and you can attend MUFON symposiums every year. And now with all of the remote work that's going on, like what we're doing, you can go on your computer and attend MUFON meetings. So, why are they doing that? Well, that's a subject of discussion, and you and I, we've talked about this. There are a lot of different reasons they could be doing that. And is it a problem? Well, if they interfered, if they influenced the UFO community to go in one direction or another, and if we knew that was going on, then that would be a problem. But if the people that would be doing that are any good, we probably wouldn't even know what was being done.
Well, I'll take it a slight step further and say that it's not the people that we have to worry about, it's the technology that we have to worry about that's involved in this textual based communication on Twitter or any type of social media. On my other monitor over here, I'm looking right now at a web page from IBM talking about the Watson Tone Analyzer, which is an AI application that corporations or government entities can use to analyze the sentiment or the tone that somebody has in their text messages, their conversations, their social media. So if the ONI or the AFOSI or whatever government agency was to implement something like the Watson Tone Analyzer, they would very easily be able to see the exact zeitgeist that UFO Twitter is having in that particular moment in time. And if it is something that is counter to what they want us to see or ingest, then they have the ability to trigger all of their other chat bots and release information that is counter to the current sentiment, to attempt to change minds and change opinions. It's a we are chess pieces, and it's up to us to decide whether we want to be a rook or a pawn.
Well, and they could also go the other way with that. They could egg us on in a direction that we're already going, to the point that things get so overheated it loses all credibility.
Absolutely, absolutely.
But you may notice that in my paper about psychological warfare and strategic deception, I constructed a timeline that's mostly based on Susan Goff's paper that she wrote to become a colonel. But it only goes to about 2003, and the reason why I didn't go further is because the world changed, and now it's a completely different world with the internet and with social media, and we've really got to put our heads together and do some serious thinking, and how all of this works in terms of the UFO problem, because whereas before it was basically manipulating the UFO community was as easy as taking candy from a baby. But now it's even easier, with
That's
social
true.
media.
It's just like we were talking about with the Jacques Vallée book coming out. People are already jumping on the bandwagon to discredit the book before it even comes out and anybody's even read it, right?
Well, I think that has a lot to do with the fact that he pulled it right before publication, and then he's bringing in a new witness or a new testimony that apparently, allegedly, has been debunked 100 times since Wednesday. So I think a lot of people have lost faith. If that part is actually true, I think a lot of people have lost faith that Vallée is doing this. Whether or not that's the reason that he pulled the book, and whether or not that new witness and the new case is being included, I don't actually know. But that's the rumor. For all I know, it could be the
Again,
Watson tone analyzer that is telling us what to think.
again, rumors, conjecture, innuendo. That's how easily the community can be manipulated.
Yeah.
That's what Tom was saying. And it's 100% legit. It is a problem. That particular point that you made, Jeremy, it is a problem. Um, and back in the day, before this technology existed, yeah, you could have bad actors that were involved in the community that were starting up rumors and trying to sway public opinion. I mean, that happens with uh, elections. I didn't want to go down that rabbit hole, but it happens. You have, um, people of influence that come out and say something, and then everybody wants to get on that person's side. Or
Yeah.
you have somebody come out and say something, and in favor of a position, and somebody comes out and to oppose it, and then you get a war going on.
Well, there's nothing wrong with opposing opinions. I mean, that's what this country is built on, is the fact that we have the ability to speak our mind. But when we have government agencies that are employing technology in mass to make it look as if 22.8 million people hold a certain opinion that they absolutely do not, in an attempt to affect the remainder of the population, that's just wrong. And that's the world that we're actually living in right now. And that goes straight back to Project or Operation Mockingbird. That's what it did.
But also, and I'm not trying to get into politics. I'm just using this as an example. But if the all-powerful government was conducting a psyop to get everyone vaccinated and wear a mask, they're not doing a very good job. So I don't know that they're as all-powerful and as all-knowing as sometimes we'd like to think.
Well, I have a statement that I've said a couple dozen times now, is not everything is a UAP and not everything isn't. And I think that can be applied to just about everything. Not everything is a psyop, but not everything isn't a psyop at the same time. And by nature of what a psyop is, if it's so easily discoverable that it is in operation, that it's a piss poor psyop right off the bat.
That's for sure.
So let's take the conversation a little bit further and bring it up to more current day events within the UFO community. Um, but first, I want to ask you, Tom. I forgot to ask you this earlier. Ultra top secret. What is that about? I had not heard about it until I read your paper.
Mhm. It came out in 2017 on the internet, and it's more material about MJ12. They have a history of MJ12 in there. There's even an interview with an alien in the document, and it it's probably one of the less professional additions in this whole sequence. I went straight to the history of the MJ12 section, and the paper makes the statement that MJ12 met in Flat Rock, Nevada, at a decommissioned Marine Air Station. So I started looking for Flat Rock, Nevada. Couldn't find it anywhere on the internet.
Sorry.
I started going to my maps. I went to road maps. I went to state maps. I went to geological maps. the atomic testing grounds, everything. No Flat Rock, Nevada. Okay. Flat Rock, Nevada was mentioned in the movie The Andromeda Strain, and it was underground. Okay. But there, now I could be wrong. If you can find, if you know of a Flat Rock, Nevada town, let me know. As far as there's only one naval air station in Nevada, and I think it's Fallon, Nevada. There aren't, and I went into Wikipedia, and I will be the first to admit that's not deep research, but I looked at their list of marine air stations and decommissioned air stations, and there are no other ones in Nevada. So that's just an example of, I spent 15 minutes on it, and I was convinced that, it's not all is straight up here.
Yeah. Google Maps, I'm typing as you're talking. Flat Rock, Nevada does not exist. And if I do a Google search on it, the first result that comes up is the Andromeda strain.
Yeah. And Bob Wood, who I consider to be a dear friend, and the man is in his 90s now, but he's very, very sharp and very alert. And he's really a top flight scientist and engineer with McDonnell Douglas for many years, but he's been a proponent of this document. And I told him right off, I said, Bob, there is no flat, it says MJ-12 met at Flat Rock, Nevada, and there is no Flat Rock, Nevada. And he said, well, but there is. It's in the Andromeda strain.
It's interesting that things similar to Operation Mockingbird, which I'm sorry for jumping in late. I don't know where you started with this or where you got into it, but it doesn't always have to be information from the government that is being used as part of Operation Mockingbird. It could be nothing less than somebody that comes from the intelligence community that happens to be friends with Steven Spielberg or George Lucas or somebody to say, hey, I really think that it would be nudge, nudge, wink, wink, great if you could incorporate this theme into your next flick. And things like that happen. And, it turns out that their next flick is Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And we even have a stand-in for Jacques Vallée, and Dr. Hynek makes his own appearance in the movie. So it's very possible that things like Operation Mockingbird, while not everything is disinformation, not everything isn't. So it could very easily be that Operation Mockingbird could have been something used to propagate useful information in a way that the public can digest, and not just pull them off the path of actual truth and discovery.
Well, and there's a book called Silver Screen Saucers, and it's kind of a history of UFOs in the movies and on TV. And the author made the point that the Air Force and the CIA and the Navy and whomever, the main thing is they don't want to be made to look bad. So yes, they have people in Hollywood who are kind of monitoring, these movies that are being made, and maybe they want the CIA or the Navy or whomever to be shown in a certain light, and they want to avoid being shown in a bad light.
Sure.
Since you mentioned Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Jeremy, that brings up a question that I had in the chat earlier, and it was related to the conversation we were having about Serpo, the project or Operation Serpo.
Yeah.
Is that the correct term for it? Is it an operation or was it a project, Serpo?
Projects are typically things that result in creations. Operations are usually things that involve human equity. So, like the Bay of Pigs would have been an operation.
Okay.
But the SR-71 would have been a project.
So it would have been an operation, Serpo, because it did deal with humans. And I didn't even know about this until Tom told me about it in one of our previous discussions. Do you want to give a quick overview of what Operation Serpo was, and then I will get to the question that came up? Tom.
All right, okay. Well, Operation Serpo appeared on the internet. I believe it was in the early 2000s. I have to go back and check to get the exact chronology. But it started appearing on a website as a number of installments. And I think there's upwards 50, 75 or more installments of the story. And the claim is that after the Roswell crash, the government people were able to work with one surviving alien who helped them establish communication with their planet civilization. And there were fatalities from the Roswell crash or crashes. And so the aliens came back to pick up their dead, and the U.S. provided an exchange, a group of military people as an exchange program. And I think the aliens dropped off one or more entities to be guests of the United States government. Now, this is the story. I'm not saying this is true, okay? This is the story that was being told on the internet. And the idea was that they took, I think, something like 12, 14 people. And, you know, you hear rumors about this kind of thing, that they chose people that were either orphans or had no traceable family history. And, but they were, you know, competent military people, and they had a huge amount of supplies, you know, to take with them, because they were planning on spending 10 years at this planet. And so these people were loaded aboard the alien ship, and they went to this planet that's called Serpo, which is in the Zeta, they claim is in the Zeta Reticuli star system, which is a binary star system. And they, you know, went there and lived and learned about the culture and the civilization and the biology and the geography and all of that. Supposedly the trip to, it's something like 50 light years away, something on that level. And the trip took something like 9 months, but they went through a wormhole or two, you know, to get there. And I think according to the story, one person died on the way, had a pulmonary embolism or something. Maybe one died over there, and one or two decided to stay, according to the story. And when they came back like 12 or 14 years later. You know, there was some kind of miscalculation in the time span, which is understandable. And that Richard Doty has claimed that someone had either, one of his ex-intelligence buddies either found out who the last surviving member of the Serpo team was, or actually located the person. He was like in his 90s at the time, and I don't know the year. And that's unsubstantiated as well. A person by the name of Lyd Caston summarized the story in the book about Serpo that you can get on Amazon or whatever. And he's just a believer in Serpo. It's 100% correct. But it's one of these situations where the information appeared anonymously. You know, there's no chain of custody. There's no one providing documentation, and the person or persons that supplied the material claims that, you know, there has to be a huge amount of documentation on it if it actually existed. It's in a vault somewhere.
So, Rodrigo, I know you got some things to say, but I want to get to Rodrigo's comment and then a question from a friend on Twitter. But Serpo is Close Encounters of the Third Kind's movie sequel, almost.
The ending of Close Encounters, absolutely.
Yeah. And yeah, that's a good point. And that relates to the question. Dave Partridge from Shadows of Your Mind magazine. Um, his question is: was Serpo originally an unofficial fan fiction associated with the movie Close Encounters? Do you have any idea on that, Tom? An
Well, there's
unofficial fan fiction?
the, you know, you hear these stories about top Hollywood people like Steven Spielberg, and who knows who he really knows. He's met President Reagan, and these people they travel in very high circles, and maybe he knows some things that we don't know. It's possible. But the ending of Close Encounters of the Third Kind, of the Americans getting on the ship and the little aliens, smiling and all that, that's tended to feed into this some sentiment by some people that there's something to Serpo. But then there's also the faction that believes that Serpo is another one of these hoaxes. The problem is we have no chain of custody, we have no provenance, we have no documentation to support it other than the story itself. It could be true or it could be false, or partially both.
Jeremy, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I mean, if we're looking directly at the ideas of things like Operation Mockingbird, I mean, we have testimony on camera where the director of the Central Intelligence Agency is being grilled by, I forget who it was in Congress, but in a senatorial or in a congressional inquiry, where the director of Central Intelligence is being asked if they ever pay, or the director of CIA, I'm sorry, if they ever pay anybody to write stories or submit articles into journals and magazines and things like that to affect the group consciousness of the United States. And the answer from the director of the CIA was yes. And then when pressed for more information, he is asking to be allowed to go into detail and answer the question in private session away from public view. But we got the information that we're looking for, that the CIA specifically, and most likely just about every other government enforcement agency out there, uh, has and is affecting ideas and directionality of thought through the written word. And they've been doing this since at least the 1960s, when we have confirmation during that Senate intelligence hearing.
Mhm.
Well, I mean, look at history. Go back to the Gulf War. Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait, and we went in there. Was there any
On my hat.
huge opposition to that by the American people? I mean,
No, of course not, because we had been primed for it. We
right.
cheered it.
Yeah, in fact,
But what the point Tom's making, though, is that weren't we primed by the media?
Of course we were.
Yes.
We were all told. We were all told that there was massive amounts of weapons of mass destruction. We were told that Saddam Hussein was using chemical warfare agents not only on his enemies but on his personnel, his own population. We were told that these things were happening. I mean, go back and look at the 19.
Plus the fact that he actually did invade a sovereign country, right?
Sure.
I mean,
Sure. He did himself no favors in
Yeah.
his longevity when he decided to be a little bit too aggressive, and that's the straw on the camel. But I mean, go back to, what is it, 96, 97, when Dustin Hoffman came out with De Niro and came out with the movie Wag the Dog. I mean, the Desert Storm was a real life version of Wag the Dog, and Wag the Dog is Hollywood's retelling of Operation Mockingbird to a T.
Yeah, and I was going to say that I remember being in the grocery store, and they have the tabloids there by the checkout counter, and I remember seeing on one of the tabloids, the headline was Saddam Hussein, he has sex with young girls, then he kills them. And it's that kind of thing that just creates this public consciousness that we may not be passionately in favor of the war, but we're not against it.
Yeah.
We let it happen, and and we're getting into this whole realm of psychological warfare and perception management and strategic influence. You're influencing the home population, the domestic population, as well as the adversaries population.
Sure.
And there was a lot of that too. Um, did they drop leaflets or did they use loudspeakers?
We did a little bit of everything.
You were there, right, Jeremy?
Yeah.
And I mean, there was plus the. I don't know if you could consider it psychological warfare, but it certainly would fit within the parameters of psychological. But that carpet bombing that they did with the B-52s, I mean, how psychological is that?
Well,
Well,
and it's
They
sorry, but
they bombed the fight right out of the troops.
they also had some very effective communications in the Desert Storm, because they would drop leaflets on Iraqi soldiers and say, "We're going to bomb the shit out of you tomorrow, and we advise you to leave." And they were actually quite successful in doing that.
So
Sorry for the cuss word.
I didn't even hear it. But we agree that the psychological warfare is effective in terms of, you know, what we've already talked about, but the use of Project Mockingbird against the American public is what we were talking about, and the fact that the intelligence community, if they want to put a message out to the American public, they have not only do they potentially have agents working for networks. That may be questionable. That may or may not be true, but they absolutely have pundits or these experts that come onto the programs that are former CIA, former intelligence community. I mean, you're muted, Jeremy. I can't hear you. You might have to drop and come back in because you got kicked for some reason. Yeah, no problem. Um, do you want to respond to what I was just saying there, Tom?
Yeah, and you wonder what's really going on, because uh, I don't think that it's any big secret that certain major TV outlets are out and out partisan, and they're each pushing their own particular agendas very, very hard. It used to be back in the old days when you had three networks and a black and white TV, that the networks, the ABC, CBS, and NBC, they at least tried to give the appearance of being objective, even though probably 90% of the people in the newsroom were liberals. But they at least tried to give the appearance of being objective. They don't even try now. They just go out and out pushing their agendas.
Yeah. What I wanted to say, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So what I wanted to say before I bounced is that we need to be very careful in saying Operation Mockingbird or Project Mockingbird, because there are two different things. There was a Project Mockingbird, which dealt with the CIA and wiretapping, but Operation Mockingbird is dealing with the CIA's payment of getting false narratives put into normal daily conversations that the American public digests.
You're right.
So the operation is the disinformation operation, or the disinformation, or the information leading campaign, because not all of it's disinformation. It's let's control the narrative, but sometimes it's with real information.
Agreed. And yeah, I apologize if I did that, man. That's something that um, I do all the time. I mix up my words, but the okay, Operation Mockingbird, is it still going on to this day? Possibly, more than likely, yes. Is it an overt operation? No, I don't think it is. But as I was saying, when you got kicked, Jeremy, the intelligence community doesn't even need to have operatives sitting at a news desk
No.
or writing articles for the news. They have these pundits, these experts, these expert witnesses that come onto all the networks and talk about the agenda of the military,
Sure. And
of
it's
the
a
DoD.
bifurcated system because for people like my parents and my grandparents who sit down and watch the news and they stay off social media, we have the pundits that are being fed the ideas that the CIA wants to have us ingest or have them ingest. For you and me and the folks on social media, the CIA's or the CIA or the government, the US government's job is even much more easy because all they've had to do is they've hired some guy that knows Python and SQL really well, and he's created 28 million chatbots, each with a unique username that goes out and uses word strings based on specific words that the US government wants us to link together. And those are responses to our Twitter messages. They are initiations to Twitter conversations. They are all over Facebook. They're 30-second advertisements that are being blasted into our eyes 24 hours a day. Operation Mockingbird is absolutely 100% in operation as far as I'm concerned, and probably much more efficient today because we submit to focus groups. We tell the government what we're thinking and how we're feeling and what products we like and what products we don't like. I mean, we're all over the woke generation right now, and we're canceling ourselves, and we're self-propagating the ideas that operations like Mockingbird wanted to manage. We've almost taken over them ourselves at this point.
Tom?
Yeah, I mean, with social media, we've, as the UFO community, I think we've completely lost control of the conversation.
Yeah, Lou Elizondo came out a couple days ago or yesterday or whenever, and he was saying that he absolutely wants to destroy ufology. And this is one of the things that I agree with him on, is that we have entered into the study of the UAP phenomenon, but if we provide publicly a theory or our own opinion on something, because let's be honest, nobody knows what the hell is really happening. So everything is theory and opinion. But if we provide to the general public something that doesn't jive with what the zeitgeist has already digested, we are publicly ridiculed, we are shamed, we are doxxed, we are yelled and screamed at. And people just absolutely lose their minds over anything that doesn't subscribe to the narrative of the day. And it's so easy for something like Operation Mockingbird to take control of a disparate type of group of people who are already infighting and be able to either get them all to go in one direction or manage them in a way that keeps them from ever getting into that focused point.
Well, but
Yeah,
you have human nature too, because I mean, the
that's
UFO
true.
community, I for a long time I've characterized it as like a political party in exile. You know, people are backstabbing each other all over the place. But that happens in all kinds of groups and all kinds of areas of life too. We're human, but we're easily manipulated as well, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, very, very. Advertising wouldn't exist if we weren't easily manipulated.
So let me get to a question. One last question I have about the report that you wrote, and I really want to encourage everybody to check out this report that Tom wrote. Man, could you say the name of it again? Because I can't find it in my notes. Tom.
MJ12, psychological warfare and strategic deception.
I posted the link in the chat window, but it's on Tom's blog. Which, can you give the address there, Tom, for everybody?
It's tomwhitmoreblog.wordpress.com. tomwhitmoreblog.wordpress.com.
So we'll get to the more modern stuff in relation to the so-called information or disinformation that's been going on. But last question I have about the report that you wrote is, um, are there parts of these documents that can actually be proven? Is there anything in these documents that's actually been brought out that's legitimate?
I read a study that somebody did. They did a kind of a computerized analysis of all of the MJ12 documents, the language and everything in them. And they found that there's one document it's not an explosive saucer crash document, but there's one document in there by General Twain that appears to be genuine. So maybe there's one document in 2,000 pages that's genuine.
Wow.
Or maybe there are more. It's possible that there are several other documents in that whole pile that are genuine. The problem is figuring out which ones.
Okay, so it hasn't come out definitively that this page of this document is legit, but the speculation is that these are some legitimate documents mixed in with a bunch of hoax documents to just sow confusion and uh, discord against amongst the UFO community for one reason or another. Is that correct?
I'm not going to go so far as to say what the motivation is, but there's plenty of evidence that a number of these documents are questionable and that are probably not authentic. But that's not to say that they might not contain some good information.
Man, the chat room is really jumping. But before we get to that, and before we get to the new material, let me just ask these questions. So, Deep Prasad at Deep Neuron on Twitter says, "Which documents do you find most credible in regards to crash retrieval material? Are there any documents that you've come across related to crash retrieval material that are credible?"
Credible, I don't know, but I think one of the most interesting, one of the most intriguing is the so-called Twining White Hot report. And that is a report of the findings, of the study of the saucer that was captured. And that's easily retrievable on the majesticdocuments.com website. It's a Twining White Hot report. I think that it's a fun read. It's very interesting to read. Now, how legitimate it is, I don't know.
Andy McGrillion from that UFO podcast asks, in regards to the psychological operations, and Jeremy, if you want to answer these too, you're welcome to.
Only if I know the answer.
Okay. Do you have any examples of a psyop, psychological op, related to the UFO topic that was initially trashed, or it was not considered legit, but it was later confirmed?
Roswell.
A psyop.
Roswell.
So
You can't say that.
Roswell is a psyop.
Well, it is, but we have no idea for what reason yet. It's a psyop to either prove or disprove that something happened there. We all know that something happened at Roswell. The United States government first claimed that it was a flying saucer, and then they came out and redacted that and said that it was a crashed weather balloon. The weather balloon portion is the psyop. We know that an event happened. We absolutely know that an event happened. We just don't know with 100% conviction what that event was.
Tom, do you have any other thoughts on that?
Well, on
So
Roswell,
go ahead.
I mentioned this in my paper, but James Carrion, he was at one time executive director of MUFON, and then he went off and started doing his own research. But he did exhaustive research on this whole business of the Army signals intelligence and what became the NSA. Running this information through the system that they were hoping the Soviets would pick up on. And the ultimate goal was to identify and perhaps turn Soviet agents, but to be able to do that by deciphering the Soviet code books. And Carrion has argued that the Roswell incident was one of these exercises that by putting this story out on the news wires and in the major media, which is not very long lived, but maybe it was long enough for the Soviets to pick up on it, start wiring back to Moscow about it, and then that would enable our cryptographic and cryptologic elements to hopefully decode more of the Soviet code books. Okay. Now, and that's not exactly a psyop, but it's an operation that could possibly yield some results. Now, that's Carrion's speculation. He doesn't know that for sure, but it's an interesting idea.
So, all right, let's change gears and talk about current day potential psyops, potential disinformation, because there's a lot of stuff
If
coming out in the news right now. Go ahead, Jeremy.
if anybody doesn't believe that the United States government runs psyops, I would direct them to look at the 2nd, 4th, 7th, and 8th psychological operations groups for the United States Army. We do this on a daily basis.
Oh yeah, psychological operations. We did talk about that earlier, Jeremy. But every branch of the military has their own psychological operations unit,
Absolutely.
including
Absolutely.
and the CIA has a psyop or psyops unit as well. The question is, are they perpetrating psyops against the U.S. public? Yes, we believe they are. Is there evidence to support it? There is some old evidence that they've come out and admitted to it, or they got caught and had to admit to it, but
Oh,
supposedly
we
disbanded that
had
program.
members of the 4th Psychological Operations Group from the U.S. Army infiltrating CNN and NPR.
Yes.
These Army,
I wouldn't use the word infiltrating. They were interning.
you
They
spelled
were
infiltrating wrong.
okay. Well, we don't need to
If you
debate
are
it.
active duty Army and you are interning at CNN as a journalist and you're still being paid by the United States Army, you have infiltrated CNN and
Yes.
NPR.
Okay. I mean, we're not disagreeing. We're not
So, and
disagreeing.
this was in 2000, and basically the 4th PSYOPs group went into places like CNN and NPR throughout the 90s, and they were helping to change the narrative that major news organizations were putting forth about the upcoming war that nobody knew was going to be happening.
Okay. So I really don't think anybody's disputing that the CIA did that. I mean, anybody that does needs to study history. But the issue is, are they still doing it today? And I mean, I think there's a strong argument that can be made that they are doing it. In what instances are they doing it? Rodrigo Vieira brings up a recent um, a recent uh, document that came out 2 years ago, a year or two ago, and I think he's talking about uh, the Wilson document, where Eric Davis and allegedly Admiral Wilson had a conversation, and then years later, this document came out from the estate of uh, the astronaut. What was his
Edgar
name?
Mitchell.
Edgar Mitchell, right? Now, and what Rodrigo's question is there any new news on that? And as a matter of fact, that document is starting to pick up some steam again. Um, it was really, it was, it was, it's got really two strong sides of argument. One side is for it, where you got Richard Dolan and Grant Cameron. I think Jimmy Church. Those guys are 100% in favor of this being accurate and true. Another guy, Joe Murgia, he continues to talk about this document. On the other side, you have most mainstream media that knows about it, uh, or who knows about it, disputes it. John Greenwald absolutely disputes it. There's probably others that I'm missing, but the idea that these this document is real, and if it is real, that it absolutely proves that crash retrieval debris and possibly even craft and alien bodies is in the hands of the government. What are your thoughts on that?
I personally think that it's legit. One of the reasons why is because there's a pretty well established chain of custody. Um, Edgar Mitchell was on, I think, the scientific advisory panel to NIDS, and apparently Eric Davis had written up these notes and sent them to Mr. Bigelow. Perhaps it was disseminated to everybody at NIDS or certain people at NIDS. And one of those people apparently would have been Edgar Mitchell. Then Edgar Mitchell passed away. There's an Australian individual, and he's not given out his name, but I'm confident that this person exists because I have another source that has had contact with this person. But this Australian person is very interested in space and he was a friend of Edgar Mitchell's. So when Edgar Mitchell passed away, the family agreed to give Mitchell's personal files to this friend and enthusiast. And this person took I guess, I don't know how much material there was, but he took the stuff back to his residence in Australia. Well, another UFO enthusiast in Australia, and I know his name, but I can't think of it right now, made contact with him and was allowed to go through all of the material and found the Admiral Wilson document. And then that person is the one that gave the document to, gave it to, oh gosh, I'm having a senior moment, but
Edgar Mitchell?
no, the UFO guy, the one that's into
Yeah.
conscious, the one
Grant,
that's
was
into
it
conscious. Yeah,
Grant
Grant
Cameron?
Cameron.
Okay,
He gave it to Grant Cameron.
right.
Grant Cameron, I don't think he even read it, but he freaked out about it, and he got with the UFO attorney guy and put it in some kind of trust. But to make a long story short, it ended up on the internet. Okay, it ended up on Reddit, and so it was public. Now, I tend to think that it's probably legitimate because I've been able to identify what to me is a fairly reliable chain of custody. This is not a situation where a document appears anonymously and you don't know where it came from. And it's not a government document, okay? And
Right.
part of John Greenwald, God love him, I think the world of him, but he kind of has an attitude that if it's not an officially government released document, then it's questionable.
Mm-hmm.
Well, to be fair, Eric Davis, who took notes that this all came out of, we may well find that his notes are still classified and still archived and yet to be released by the United States government.
It's possible. But, Bigelow holds his cards very close to his vest, and he's really released very little information. This situation arose in a way that nobody foresaw. Eric Davis had no intention of ever making that document public. And it was because of this combination of circumstances where Edgar Mitchell passed away and it fell into a third party's hands that it was able to become public. And I think Eric Davis has had to have been very upset about this thing surfacing. And it's also interesting to note certain people have claimed that it's a fake and all that. But if it was fake, don't you think that Eric Davis would be the first one to come out and say that it's fake, that he has nothing to do with it? But he's never said that. He and Putoff have just said, we can't comment.
Well, this may be something that, and I'm playing devil's advocate here. This is not what I believe, but I'm just saying that something like this could very well be possible, that if a leak had occurred, a damage control from the United States government could have gone back over to Davis and said, hey, here's an extra $50,000 for your next research project, but don't publicly deny or admit anything in these documents.
Possibly, but also, according to the notes, Admiral Wilson agreed to meet with him because he had been told by people that he trusted that Eric Davis is okay, and that according to that document, it was never intended to be made public. It was supposed to be private. And so by the document becoming public, because apparently it was disseminated to at least Edgar Mitchell and probably other people at NIDS, and because of the combination of circumstances, Eric Davis essentially has gone against his agreement with Admiral Wilson. And that's not a good situation for Eric Davis or Admiral Wilson.
That's true. And even if they weren't classified, he made a promise to Admiral Wilson to keep it quiet. It came out, and the fact that he had documented that conversation, that meeting, for him to even respond to it, it's not going to look good. So his best bet is to actually just deny it, or just not even comment on it. Rodrigo asked if Putoff actually did specifically talk about the document.
In passing, Hal Putoff gave a talk in West Virginia last year that I attended. And he either said he couldn't comment on it, or he just barely briefly, mentioned it in passing. Putoff and Davis do not want to talk about this.
So let's put that on the back burner, because that's interesting stuff, but it's really in the realm of, what do you believe, and what can you prove? There's very little that you can prove because nobody who is in the know is really talking about it. But we have two things coming up that are of great interest and could potentially be linked to what we're talking about tonight, and that's psychological operations and disinformation. And the things that I'm referring to are the UAPTF report and the recent announcement by the Inspector General to do an evaluation on the DoD and its UFOs studies. So, first of all, this report that's due out in June, I think everybody's pretty much already accepted that it's more than likely going to be an announcement that we need, or that they need another 180 days to complete it. We may get a preliminary report. What are your thoughts, Tom?
Sometimes I think that some people in the UFO field are like starving beggars, and they're looking for any little crumb of information they can get. I think we just have to wait and see what happens. I mean, there's been all this talk and all of this angst and emotion about this, and we don't know what's going to be in the report or not going to be in the report. But I can tell you this much: if a report comes out, I doubt seriously if the public is going to get anything that is truly interesting. If there is anything that's really interesting, it's going to be briefed to the Senate and the House, the Gang of Eight types. It's going to be briefed to them in closed session. Now, I can't say for sure that it's going to be a nothing burger. I hope there's interesting information in there. But if I had to flip a coin and bet, I'd bet you lunch that it's basically going to be a nothing burger. But it's probably not fair for me to say that and say that we should wait and see what happens. I think we really just need to wait and see what comes out.
Yeah, I'm eating that giant nothing burger.
Yeah.
We're not going to see anything. You and Andrew and I, we're not going to see anything from that. There's going to be two sides to this report: the classified version and the unclassified version. Even assuming in a perfect world scenario that the Senate Select Committee for Intelligence is going to be told the truth, we can't even guarantee that they're going to be told the truth, because these are private citizens that go into elected office that in theory rotate in and out every 4 years. And I do not believe that the mechanisms that are in place and have been in place for the past 70 years would ever trust them with the correct information. So they're going to be told something. I guarantee they'll be told something, and it will be held at a classified level, but I do not believe that what the Senate Select Committee is going to hear is going to be the God's honest truth. And if they're not going to be told the truth, we sure as hell won't be.
Well,
And
there are a
that's
couple of.
where I'm sorry, Tom. I just want to make
Excuse
a
me.
point real quick. I just want to make a point that is where it falls into the realm of another psychological operation. If
Well,
if they do give us information that is untrue,
you
is
have
it
to look at the reason for the report. The report is asking not to tell us what's in the skies. The report is asking us to highlight the processes by which we investigate this phenomenon, right? So that report going out and being classified and being on SIPR and NIPRNet and JWIX or wherever it ends up being held and classified, that is going to be intercepted and studied by our enemies. So by us detailing exactly how we investigate UAP and putting it into print somewhere in a cohesive binder, regardless of classification, China, Russia, even our allies like Israel are going to get access to that. We have crappy maintenance on our state secrets. They're going to get access to that, and we know that. So who is to say that this is just a grand stage, a huge spectacle where we have used the past 180 days to drum up worldwide anticipation of what's in this report so that we can finally give Russia and China a bunch of crap that makes them spin cycles on their computer systems to try to decipher what the hell it is that we're doing.
okay?
This might not be
Tom,
for us.
that's true. That is a good point. But Tom, what were you going to say?
Well, and there are a couple of other things. There's talk on the UFO street, or from my source, that the Air Force has been stonewalling on this. So maybe the Navy provides some information, maybe some other agencies provide something, maybe the Air Force doesn't provide diddly squat, okay? Secondly, some people are thinking that this thing has the force of law, and it doesn't. It's a request by the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence for information, and technically, the DoD can stonewall them and basically tell them nothing. Okay.
Yeah.
And a third point I'd like to make is that I think that Christopher Mellon and Luis Elizondo checkmated DoD. they've backed them into the corner to where they have to do something. So this is going to be interesting to see how this plays out in that
Well, that's where
respect.
the IG complaint comes in, or the IG report comes in. So now the Senate Select Committee for Intelligence request, as you said, it has no teeth. The DoD can spin their heels, and the Air Force can turn tail and not provide any information on this and push back the deadline to another 180 days. Then the IG comes into play. What people don't realize is that this is an evaluation, not an investigation. But evaluations often lead to investigations. But an evaluation may take a year, or it may take 5 years, or it may take 10 years to get to the portion of the investigation. So now we have an investigation that is another year, or 5 years, or 10 years. So, best or worst case scenario, we're already looking at T minus 20 years before we get any solid information out of the UAPTF report.
Well, and
Carl,
you get
Carl
into
Anderson
the
said,
idea of,
"Expect nothing and you get nothing," and he's right. I mean, you put out the positive vibes that we want, and what Luis Jimenez is doing with the Big Phone Home by getting the grassroots effort out there and getting the people involved in this whole thing. That's one of the biggest movements that we could actually do to try to get this information into our own hands, into the public hands.
Yeah. I mean, I put out a statement on YouTube a couple weeks ago. I've changed my mind a couple times since then. But as I was saying earlier, the IG is reactive, not proactive. They don't initiate anything by themselves. So the timing of the big phone home and all this disclosure push, which I think was absolutely amazing, and my hat's off to Luis Jimenez, but
100%.
it may have come at a time where the common household dweller watching the 6 o'clock news isn't yet ready for it, and somebody knows this. So you launch a complaint, and some senator may have lost their walking trail and not gotten the $22 million for basketball courts or for whatever else, and that went to ATIP, and now a senator is upset, so they launch an IG complaint. Now this could have occurred 5 or 10 years ago, and it has taken the IG that long to act on an evaluation to get it to a complaint status, or to get it to an investigation status. And now we have what we have. So we don't
Okay,
know
let
what's happening, or we don't know what
let
triggered any
uh,
of this.
let Tom respond, Jeremy.
I'm going to be naive about the whole IG thing, but just from my own naive perspective, I see Christopher Mellon's fingerprints on that.
That's interesting.
I, and I
Would
hope
you
they
like to
are.
expound?
Well, I mean, Mellon has his finger on the pulse on this whole deal. And he knows, for example, that the Air Force may be stonewalling. And he also knows that maybe there's not cooperation or coordination between other agencies going on. And so Mellon, the UFO people don't seem to, I'm sorry to sound like I'm talking down, but a lot of people don't seem to realize that Christopher Mellon understands the levers of power between the Congress and the Pentagon. He understands how it works. He knows which buttons to push. And he went smartly through the Congress to force this issue on the DoD. Because if they tried to go through just DoD, it would have gotten lost in a maze and nothing would have ever happened. The guy knows what he's doing. And so when I see that, it seemed to me extremely odd that there would be an announcement by the Inspector General that they're looking into how this whole thing is working. That struck me as very odd, and that's why I think Mellon may be behind it.
I certainly hope he is, because if I'm wrong, I'm a lot happier than if I'm right. The only counter that I would have to that is for our Chris Mellon to do that, and if he did do that, there are 20 other Chris Mellons on the opposing team pushing the opposite buttons, trying to quash it.
Well, and we started hearing these things in the 80s, that there's a faction of people that want disclosure, there's a faction that doesn't want disclosure. And we're hearing that today. The Air Force does not want to get into UFOs publicly. They've been there, they've done that. They do not want that. So I can almost guarantee you that they're the faction or part of the faction that's opposing all this.
Gentlemen, I hate to cut the party short. I have some domestic issues that I need to take care of. So, Andrew, Tom, it was an absolute pleasure to finally meet you, Tom, and hope to carry this conversation offline.
Thanks for
Great to meet you,
jumping in,
Jeremy.
Jeremy.
And let's
Appreciate
keep
you
in
being here.
touch, okay?
Absolutely, Andrew. If you want to give Tom my contact information, please do so.
Well, it's Twitter, Jeremy
It's
Unidentified one.
right there on Twitter. I can't
Yeah.
figure out which way. Yeah, there we go.
And your website, just give me your website real quick, man.
It's Jeremy D. McGowan, MCGOWAN.com. So, Jeremy, here, I'll put it in the main chat. You can check it out there.
And Tom's information will be in the chat. And Jeremy, have a good
Enjoy.
night.
Thank you, guys.
Cool.
Uh-huh.
And Tom, well, I mean, that was about the time where I was going to wrap it up anyway. Did you have any final thoughts you wanted to mention before we close it out?
Wait and see, keep studying, and keep learning.
Absolutely.
And I hope I haven't given the impression that I don't want disclosure. I'd be delighted to hear everything, okay? But I've just seen this kind of thing go on before. But the current circumstances really are very interesting.
And hopeful. I mean, I anybody who's not hopeful at this point is just not paying attention, because if you talk to the old timers, like, I'm sorry to call them old timers, but the people that have been around this topic for decades, Richard Dolan, Grant Cameron, the people who've been studying this for decades, yourself, even Preston Dennett, and several other people that I could name, they're very encouraged by what's happening, even though there may be nothing coming out in this report, or very little at the most. It's still movement in the right direction. The needle is moving in the forward direction. It's not standing still. And like you said, Chris Mellon and Lou Elizondo have probably the biggest platform in the world on this topic right now. Those two guys, and combining their efforts, it's just really making some waves happen. So it's good to be positive right now.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me on.
Yeah,
I've enjoyed it very much.
yeah, and it's I know it's getting late in your neck of the woods, so thank you again for being here, Tom. You're always welcome to come back. Next time you drop a paper, hit me up. We'll come back on here because I know you're going to have new information. We'll have another conversation about it.
Okay, Andrew. Take care now.
And everybody in the chat room, thanks for being here. Thanks for all your interactions. And everybody have a great night. I'll see you next time.